Thank you so much for your patience on this. It has been just kind of a whirlwind around here, and I've been trying to get this video to you a lot. I've tried a few times and just different circumstances have come up and I haven't been able to. But again, thank you again for your patience. So let's get started. We are going to make a sourdough loaf today. Actually, this recipe, you're gonna make 2 sourdough loaves. So surprise, you're making 2 loaves of bread. Now, the first thing I wanted to say is that most of you, your sourdough starter is ready. I mean, I've seen it grow, I've seen how it grows and falls, and that's wonderful. That's exactly what you want it to be doing. The first thing you should know about making bread is that you're going to need a lot more starter than what you have right now. But because your starter is growing as quickly as it is, you'll have enough in no time, I promise. What you want to do is grow your starter to at least 100 grams. And the reason for that is because for this recipe, you need 200 grams of really bubbly, ready to go sourdough starter. So start feeding your starter, pull it out of the refrigerator, wherever you've got it. Start feeding it so that you have at least 100 grams of sourdough starter. When you have those 100 grams, you're ready to go. An important note on this. Making sourdough bread takes at least 24 hours. So my suggestion to you would be to work backwards. When do you want your bread ready, nice and hot, fresh from the oven? And then work backwards so that you know when to start your starter, when to feed it, how to get going, because this is a long process. So number 1, you need to know when you want your bread ready. And number 2, you need at least 100 grams of sourdough starter. So the first thing I did this morning was wake up nice and early and fed my sourdough starter. I pulled 100 grams of my discard out, fed it 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, and I have let it sit for at least 6 hours. This is what I have right here. You can see it's bubbly and it's got plenty of gluten strands. That pulling, you can see that's gonna help in our gluten. So my starter is ready to go. That's an indication that I'm ready to start my bread. I like to start my bread in one of these big tubs. I do this because I make tons of bread at a time, and this is just an easy way for me to do that. It comes with a lid like this, but you can use a regular bowl. I used bowls and a clean kitchen towel over my bowls for months before I ever moved on to something like this. So a bowl just like this with a towel over the top is just fine for this. The first thing you're gonna do is measure out 700 grams of water. So room temperature tap water, that's what I use to feed my starter. If you use something different to feed your starter, use that type of water. Spring water, well water, whatever it is that you use the same water you've been using to feed your starter this whole time. So I've got 700 grams of water. Now that I've got my 700 grams of water in here, I'm gonna add 200 grams of my sourdough starter. And you can see as it's hitting the water, it's kind of floating back up to the top. That's another great indication that your starter is ready to go. You can take a cup of water and spoon in a tiny bit of your starter. If it floats at the top for a couple of seconds, you are good to go to make bread. So now, check this out. I've got some discard here. This is great. I'm gonna use this again. I'm gonna store this in the refrigerator to grow it to make more bread. This is what you call sourdough discard at this point. When you take this and you feed it again, now you've got more starter, you can use it for more recipes. Now I'm gonna take my dough hook and I'm gonna mix in my starter really, really well. I want it to dissolve completely into the water. So here you can see it's kind of foamy, it's nice and dissolved. It's basically sourdough water at this point. Now I'm going to add 1,000 grams of flour. All-purpose flour, whatever flour you've been using to feed your starter, that's what you're gonna use. Okay, so you're almost there. This is how you make bread. Water, starter, flour, that's it. We're gonna add a little bit of water and salt later, so stick around for that. But right now we're just going to go ahead and mix this as best we can with our hands. It's gonna be a really kind of sticky, shaggy dough. It will not look like bread dough really at first, but just go ahead and keep massaging the flour into the water. You want it to absorb all of the water and stir that's in there. You don't want any dry spots. So with clean hands, I'm just gonna go in and I'm gonna start stirring this up. Okay, so you can see my shaggy dough is right here. It's actually very, very sticky, but it's not very wet, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like clumpy and shaggy. So this is where your bench scraper comes in. You're gonna wanna scrape this off your hands. So as I'm getting all of this off of my hands, I'm going to think about letting this rest. This resting period is called an autolyze phase. This phase allows all of the flour in your mixture to absorb as much water as possible. And the reason for that is because you don't want any dry, chunky spots in your dough. You want it to be a really nice, homogeneous dough, cohesive dough. You want it to be very even all the way through. So one of the ways we do that is by allowing the dough to just sit and rest and soak up any of that moisture that's in here. The reason we don't add the salt right now is because the salt is going to draw out moisture. That's just what the nature of salt, that's what it does. It draws out moisture. So you don't want to add it too early because you don't want that to kind of mess with the moisture inside of your mixture now. So I'm also going to take my bench scraper and I'm going to scrape around the sides of this bin. Again, this works perfectly well in a bowl with a tea towel. And I'm gonna let this sit for at least 30 minutes. You can let this go 2 hours if you need to, if you want to go do something else or you get distracted, that's fine. At least 30 minutes, we're gonna let this dough sit. And in the meantime, we're gonna get our salt ready. So here I have a bowl with 50 grams of flour and 20 grams of salt. I'm going to dissolve the salt as much as I can into the water. I use a kosher salt or a pink salt. You can use any salt that you prefer. I like the coarse salt to cook with, so that's really what I use, and then pink salt works just as well. And you don't have to change the measurement depending on the type of salt. As long as you've got 20 grams of salt and 50 grams of water, then that's plenty. So I've got that in a bowl and I kind of broke up the salt with my hands, and I'm gonna leave it to the side because we're gonna add that after we autolyze. Okay, so our dough has been sitting for 30 minutes to autolyze. All of that flour has absorbed as much water as possible. So now we're gonna hit it with more water. We're gonna add those 50 grams of water and salt that are in here. If all of the salt isn't dissolved, that's fine. Just give it a bit of a stir and dump that in. Get all the salt. And now again, with clean hands, I'm going to squeeze the heck out of this dough. I want that salt and water to be incorporated all throughout the dough. It's gonna start getting really smooth and kind of watery. And then just keep squeezing. It's doing what it's supposed to do. So I'm going to just stick my hand in there and give it a good squeeze while also lifting the dough off of the sides of the tub and bringing it over itself right in the middle. So I'm squeezing and I'm turning my tub and giving my dough a nice mix. Go all the way around. Again, really sticky, but more hydrated. You're gonna be able to tell the difference between the shaggy stage and then this stage where it's a much more hydrated dough. Do not skimp on a good bench scraper. I recommend a plastic one because it's flexible. You're gonna want to scrape this dough right off of your hands. Again, nice and sticky, really shiny. You can see it's a much more hydrated dough. So I'm gonna get all this dough off of my fingers and scrape around the edges here. And I'm gonna explain to you how we are going to get this dough ready for the refrigerator. This isn't a traditional yeast dough, so we do not need to knead this dough. This dough is actually a little bit more delicate because you want to help promote that yeast and bacteria that we have grown our colony to go ahead and eat here and grow, but also we don't want to smash it and kind of kill it off either. So what we're gonna do, instead of kneading this dough, we're going to fold it. So what that means is we're gonna go around our bowl or tub or however in 4 places, and we're going to pull the dough up and stretch it and then fold it over itself right in the middle and turn it 90 degrees, pull our dough up and stretch it over, turn it 90 degrees again. And so we're gonna do that 4 times. And that's called folding your dough. We're gonna do that process 6 times total. So I just did it once here, but we're gonna do it 5 more times in 30-minute increments. So that's 2.5 hours of folding. So we're gonna let it rest, fold, let it rest, fold. We're gonna do that 5 more times. Okay, so 30 minutes has passed since we added our salt and water, and now we're gonna fold our dough for the second time. Guys, this is super sticky, so I recommend having a bowl of water nearby so you can dip your hands in. It'll kind of help ease, that stickiness, and also your bench scraper. Again, you're gonna need this nearby. So I'm gonna get my hands, my right hand, my dominant hand, damp here. And just as I explained before, I'm gonna go in to my dough here all the way to the bottom. I'm gonna grab some and pull it up and toward me to the middle. It's okay if it breaks up a little bit like that. So every time we're doing that, we are strengthening the gluten that's in our dough. And every time we do that, you're gonna notice that the dough is gonna start shrinking on itself. It's gonna start pulling, it's gonna kind of start fighting back. And that's exactly what you want. So right now it's okay that it looks like this, kind of wet. Again, turn it 90 degrees and do that again. Turn it 90 degrees, pull, and toward you. You wanna pull as far as it'll go without tearing off completely. Okay, so another 30 minutes has passed. I'm going to go ahead and give my bread another fold. So this is the third fold. I'm gonna get my water, dunk my hand in, and again, I'm gonna go in, make my way all the way to the bottom here, and I'm gonna pull up. You can see it's already a lot more elastic, and fold it over itself. Turn 90 degrees and do that again. Pull up and over. Turn, pull up and over. Turn, up and over. So it's still pretty sticky, but not as sticky as it was before. It's becoming more of a cohesive dough. It's not just kind of all over the place. And it's coming back together pretty quickly. The more folds that I perform, the more I'm stretching and strengthening the gluten that's in here, and the more I'm making this bread kind of want to shrink up in itself and creating more tension. So we're on the right track. 2 more folds, so I'm gonna let this rest 30 minutes again and fold 2 more times. Now that we've completed our folding, it's time to shape the dough. So you're gonna need your bench scraper again and plenty of flour on deck. So here's what we're gonna do. First, we're going to get our dough out of our tub. I'm going to sprinkle a clean surface liberally with flour. And then I'm going to help my dough out. There we go. Now, if you remember earlier, I said this is making 2 loaves of bread. So it doesn't look like a whole lot of dough, but remember this is gonna rise overnight. So we're going to, again, flour it liberally over the top. Don't be afraid of flour at this point. You're gonna need it to make sure that you have plenty of flour on your hands and on your surface so your dough doesn't stick. It is very sticky. Now I'm gonna cut this in half. If you wanna be precise and get both loaves to be the exact same size, you wanna weigh it. This will make 2 loaves that are 970 grams each. So you could cut it down the middle and then go ahead and place it on a scale. And if it's 970, you're good to go. Both will be right around 970. I just give them kind of a rough circle shape like this, and then plop them on the scale, make sure they're 970 grams. I can tell because I've made so many, this is pretty close, so I'm not gonna pull my scale out. But now what I wanna do is go ahead and shape this into, again, a rough circle. Just by gathering the dough in my hands, I wanna be gentle and use my fingertips and move quickly because I don't want it to stick to my hands. It is gonna be sticky, so it's all right if it does. You can always grab a little flour, roll that in your hands, and give it a nice little round turn like this, kind of fold it over itself, and tuck the edges around. And I've got a pretty good circle right there. So I'm gonna do the same thing on this side. Pull in the edges around to make a circle. Doesn't have to be super tight. We just want to, this is kind of our pre-shape. And now we're gonna let our dough relax. Every time we do this, we are working the dough, we're working the gluten. We wanna give it some time to relax so it doesn't seize on us and it's easy to work with. So now that I've got these into nice round circles, I'm gonna dust a little more flour over the top and let them rest 30 minutes. You can cover them with a tea towel, a clean dish towel, just leave them on the counter and let them rest for 30 minutes. Okay, our dough has been resting 30 minutes, and I went ahead and grabbed my 2 bannetons. Now, these are not essential for making bread. When I first started, I would use these like regular baskets to proof my dough overnight in the refrigerator. I would take a regular basket to allow airflow, and then I would put in a paper towel to put my dough in the refrigerator. You do not need a banneton to make bread, but I highly recommend these. They're just very easy to work with, and that way you're not dirtying something else that is not meant for bread and getting floury, because this is gonna get a lot of flour on it. So I'm going to heavily flour my 2 bannetons because I want to make sure I create a surface of flour here so that my dough doesn't stick. Once I have my dough shaped, I'm going to stick them in these bannetons, and it's gonna rest overnight in the refrigerator, what's called cold proofing or cold retarding, because I want my dough to ferment but at a slower pace, so the refrigerator really helps with that. So I'm going to flour my bannetons really well. Get that flour. Rice flour is ideal, to be honest. I use rice flour when I bake bread for markets and a large quantity because I want to make sure it never sticks. But regular flour works great too. You do not have to order, a different type of flour that you're only going to use for bread for that. Okay, so once we've got our dough here relaxed, you can see it's kind of spread out a little bit. It even has some bubbles starting to appear here on the top. It's beautiful. It's looking great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove one and just kind of move it over while I work with one dough at a time. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to try and create as much surface tension as we can. Surface tension is going to give us a really great crispy crust, and it's going to give us an even layer of crust all the way around. So I'm going to flour again very liberally here. Don't be shy. And once I've got this nicely floured, I'm gonna flip this over. So this is gonna be on the bottom here. I'm gonna get some of that flour to go underneath, and then I'm gonna take my bench scraper and flip that over. So you can tell it's kind of sticky here. Didn't have any flour on it, that's fine. My goal is to turn this circle into an oblong shape, so an oval. And by doing that, the way I'm gonna do that is by taking my fingertips only, gently going under my dough, and with my fingertips and my thumbs, I'm going to pull very carefully this dough toward me like this. You can see it's starting to stretch the top and the bottom. I wanna get a nice, even shape here. Can see that we're working our dough. So we've got a nice long oval shape. And now I'm going to take the bottom third of my dough and I'm gonna fold it up to the middle here, just like that. And then I'm gonna take the sides, and using my thumbs and my palms and my fingertips, I'm going to gently grab the dough on either side here and pull, and fold one on top of the other, right across the middle. So fold one side, fold the other, kind of pinch it so it gathers. And I've got kind of this letter shape, so I'm going to pull my dough up, away from me at the top, and then again bring it to the middle. I've got these funky little, I call them like antennas, but you've got an envelope shape here. So I'm gonna take the sides of my dough and pinch in the middle, kind of creating a stitch shape. Might not stick fully to each other, each side to each other, but that's okay. Just keep working down. So I've got some stitches going on here. And when I get to the bottom, I'm gonna grab my dough here, the side that's closest to me, and I'm gonna pull it over itself while rolling tightly into a ball. And using the surface of my counter, I need more flour, to create tension here. I want it to be nice and tight on both sides, just like this. And you can tell here my ends are kind of uneven, so I'm going to get my dough and go over those kind of pointed ends. I want an even shape on the sides if I can manage it. So I'm going to make sure that's nice and even and tucked on both sides. I'm going to take my bench scraper and I'm going to tuck the dough in under itself to create a really nice top here. I want this as tight as possible without tearing. So The reason we did all those stretch and folds while we were doing that, we were creating a lot of strength in our dough, and that's why it's not tearing right now. So that means we did a good job with our folds. And we wanna, again, it's getting sticky, so I'm gonna liberally put a little more flour on there until we've got our nice rectangle shape. Now this is ready to go in our bannetons, and we're gonna flip it upside down. So the way I like to do this is take my banneton, get it here nice and close to me, and then I'm going to flip my dough, and with one of my hands on top of the dough and the bench scraper going underneath, I'm gonna flip it upside down here like this, like a baby, and gently place it into my banneton. Oh, got some dough there. Again, once you've got it in here, you can give it another pinch. We'll do that again before we bake it, so that it's nice and tight and gathered together. If you see any parts that don't have any flour or that are a little stickier than the rest, feel free to go ahead and just sprinkle a little more flour. Now we're gonna do our other dough. I'm gonna sprinkle some flour on our surface again. Take our dough and flip it over. We're gonna gently take our fingers and our thumbs and create an oblong oval shape. Stretching gently, not to tear the dough, but again, building more surface tension as we do that. Once we've got a nice oval or rectangle, or however you wanna do it, it can be more of a rectangle shape too, that's fine. I'm gonna take my dough from the bottom third, and I'm gonna fold it up on itself, give it a light press, and then I'm gonna take the sides with my palms and my thumbs, fold one side over the other, just like this, kind of pinch it together, and then take the top, my letter, fold it down to the middle, and take my antenna side pieces and fold them over themselves in a stitch form. I can usually get 4, maybe 5 stitches. Take the bottom, pull it up over itself, and tightly roll. I'm using the surface of my countertop and my fingertips to kind of just pull the dough in on itself. Oh, that's looking really good. Okay. So what I like to do at this point is kind of gather up the flour I've got on my surface, so I'm not wasting all of my flour here, and kind of tuck it in underneath my dough. And again, move it back and forth nice and tight. I want to create that tension over the top, but I'm not tearing my dough. I'm going to pinch in my sides so we've got a nice even edges and corners. You can pinch it together. It'll pinch, you know, it's still pretty sticky under all that flour, so if you pinch it, it'll also stick to itself. Very good. More flour over the surface. Give it a nice pull. You want to pull and push, not tearing the surface, but giving it a nice tight roll. Now I'm going to grab my banneton, turn my dough, nice even shape, flip it over, got my baby here, and lay it in my banneton. I'm going to give one more stitch here. I want to pull those edges nice and tight. And that is it. Now what I'm going to do is put these plastic shower caps. I know this is super ghetto. Shower caps are really great. You can buy a whole bunch on Amazon for super cheap, and they're reusable until you tear them. I tear them all the time. But basically you want to create a seal here, not an airtight seal, but you do want to cover it from, you know, anything from the refrigerator. You don't want it to dry out. And so that's why these are great, because it'll actually cinch, but it doesn't, it does allow air to circulate, but just not as much. So you can use a paper bag, or you can use a plastic bag. So I used to go to Walmart and just get extra plastic bags that were unused and wrap my basket in that and give it, you know, just like a one knot, and stick them in the refrigerator, and worked great. So if you wanted to use these, you know, go for it. You can also use a clean shopping bag. So now our dough is going to sit overnight in the refrigerator for a minimum of 12 hours. That is important. So in that time, our dough is going to relax. It's going to rise. Our starter is going to keep doing what it does and eating some of that sugar in here, and it's gonna rise. So once we take these out of the refrigerator tomorrow, you're gonna see they're gonna be a lot higher, close to this edge here of the banneton or even above it, so that we can move on to the baking stage. But yeah, so that's it for day one. And now these are gonna sit in the refrigerator a minimum of 12 hours, as I said. They can sit longer. You can allow your dough to ferment up to 48 hours is what I have done. Some people go as far as 72 hours. Now, the risk with that is, number one, you could risk your sourdough starter going hungry, and so it's going to deflate, and once you put them in the oven to bake, they won't rise as much. That means that you kind of missed your window for your rise, just kind of like your sourdough starter, and you're going to get a flat loaf. The other reason I don't do that is because the longer it sits, the more sour it becomes. I like my sourdough bread to have a really nice sourdough flavor, but not too sour. It's not over the top, so that's just my preference. I have left it at least 48 hours before, and it's okay. It is a little bit more sour, but if you were going to let these proof overnight on the counter, which is another option you can do, you do not want to overproof them in the heat. So Florida, super hot in the summer, and if you were to proof these overnight on the counter, they would kind of grow over your size. You'd have kind of a sticky mess in that situation. But overproofing is a real thing. You can accidentally overproof these in the refrigerator, but I think 24 to 48 hours is kind of a sweet spot. 12 hours, 15 hours is usually my threshold and when I like to bake them. But if something happens and you can't get to it the next day, the following day will be just fine. So day one is complete. Now these go in the refrigerator to ferment and proof for a minimum of 12 hours. Let's talk about your baking options. You really want to stay in the realm of cast iron for baking sourdough. And the reason for that is because you want to create a very hot steam situation for your bread. That's how you're going to get a really nice crust all the way around it and also create some of those blisters. And for that, you need to create steam. There's a few different ways that people do this. Number one, trial and error is a great way. I've baked hundreds of loaves, but these are the things that worked best for me when I was just starting out and I wasn't baking in this big oven. So I started out with this cast iron Dutch oven that I have had for years and years and years. As you can see, it's very well loved. It has a tight fitting lid. It is very heavy duty, and it's enamel coated. So you have a nice snug lid. It's heavy bottom. This is a 6.5 quart, I believe. Anything 6.5 or larger is the way to go. Now, as I realized that this was a business for me and I wanted to upgrade a little bit and also bake more than one loaf of bread at a time, I added on this guy, which is wonderful. So this is specifically made for baking bread. You can see the little wheat design right there on the top. And this cookware is made by a company that makes specific cookware for baking bread. So this is pricey, and to be honest, it's very heavy, but again, well loved. You can bake 2 smaller loaves in here. You can make 1 large loaf. You can do different sizes, and the lid is nice and tight. This is cast iron. I think altogether it weighs about 22 to 25 pounds, so it is quite heavy. Now, when I bake in my regular home oven, I bake 2 loaves at a time, so I will use both of these at once. So, for you, depending on the size of your oven, you might be able to fit 1 cast iron Dutch oven or pot or one of these guys, or you can do 2. So it just really depends on how much bread you're going to be baking. Is it worth it for you to get something specific for bread baking, or can you get by with a Dutch oven? I'll have some links for you to kind of see on Amazon. I've also purchased some other ones on Amazon before I got this large oven. But the idea is to have something heavy duty, heavy bottomed, cast iron, and with a tight fitting lid. Some people even use 2 cast iron skillets, so one on top of the other, and they create their seal that way. Really, it just depends on your use, what you have, your capacity of your oven, and what your preference is. So I've got my oven preheated, screaming hot. I've got both of my Dutch ovens into the oven, and I've got it preheated at 475, as pretty much as hot as it gets. I mean, you could go up to 500, but I recommend starting around 475 just to see how it turns out. Some ovens run a little hotter or cooler than others, but I'll tell you what to look for with that as well. So I've got both of my Dutch ovens in the oven, preheating at 475. I want those in there nice and hot, so I'm gonna leave them in about half an hour, and I'm gonna make sure the oven is preheated for at least 10 minutes, completely preheated for at least 10 minutes before I add my bread. So here are my loaves that I put in overnight, and as you can see, they've risen quite a bit above the edge here. This one a little bit more. So when you remove the cover, you'll be able to tell the bread is ready a few different ways. Number one, it's risen. So that's a good indication. Number two, they jiggle quite a bit. Great indication. And we're gonna indent our finger here a little bit and it springs right back up. There's no, I mean, you can kind of tell where my finger has been, but it'll spring right back up. So that one is ready to bake. This one, again, ready to bake. And so I do this quite simply. Actually, we'll restitch these right on top. So I'm gonna show you how I do that. And then I put them onto a parchment paper. The reason I bake these in cast iron skillets and parchment paper is because I want to avoid them sticking at all. Now, sometimes your cast iron won't heat properly or your dough will be slightly stickier, and I just want to avoid that kind of situation. You can't always mitigate those before they occur. So I find that it's a lot easier to just go ahead and bake them on parchment paper because they won't stick at all. You can spray a little bit of cooking spray on the parchment paper if you like, to just kind of also do a little bit extra protection on the nonstick. I will tell you that one time I baked these on parchment paper and a little bit of dough got caught on the end here. I just like didn't put it on properly, and that paper got baked into the bread. I had to break open the loaf to pull the paper out, and it would have been a lot easier to do had I had some cooking spray on there. You guys know I don't love unnatural ingredients, but this is a cooking spray that I do use occasionally, especially if I'm cranking out a lot of loaves at a time for market or something like that, because I want to avoid any, running into the situation where I have to sacrifice a loaf because it got stuck to something. So this cooking spray is great. It has flour in it as well, so it gives you kind of that extra protection of not sticking. So I'm gonna take 2 pieces of parchment paper. Well, it's 1 large piece. I cut it down, and I'm gonna go ahead and give these a quick spray. You don't need much. Right in the middle is just fine. And I'm gonna set those to the side. So now we're gonna stitch just like before. I'm gonna take my loaf and I'm gonna grab at the ends here. I'm gonna see if I can do it so you can see. I'm gonna prop this up a little bit. I'm gonna take my sides and pinch them together like I'm stitching, one right on top of the other, just like this. One right on top of the other. And as I'm doing that, I'm gathering the sides in a little bit so I get more of a tighter loaf. And again, we're building more surface pressure. Every time that we do that, we're creating more surface tension, and that's always gonna give us a better crust. So I'm gonna stitch all the way down 6 or 7 times, 8 times, however many times you want really. And then I'm gonna grab the ends and pull out and over. So out and over. So this guy is ready. I'm gonna grab my parchment and put my parchment paper right on top. Nice and tight, and flip. Now if we put enough flour on here, it won't stick. And it looks good. There we go. So that comes right off. And let's do the other one. So again, gather the sides and stitch over. You can see this one's a little bigger. Sometimes if you didn't measure it properly, one loaf will be a little bigger than the other. That's fine. Usually I give them a good measuring so I know that they're gonna be the exact same. So now that I've got that all stitched together, I'll place my parchment paper on top and flip. Ta-da! Beautiful. Okay, so now we've got our 2 loaves, and this is the fun part. You can score it and make any fun designs. So If you are going to score it and just practice any kind of design, go ahead and give this a nice little flour dusting so you get more of a contrast. But if you score it like this, you might not be able to see the design because you can tell there's not a lot of flour on top. So you would just add a little flour on top, rub it in so it's not clumpy, and then go ahead and design whatever you're gonna put on top. If you don't wanna get fancy, that's totally fine too, but you do need to score it somewhere. You don't want it to break open and bust somewhere that you don't want it. So if you do not score this bread, the steam and the heat inside the bread will kind of break it open at any weak point. So it could break open on the top or on the sides or wherever. So that's what that scoring is for ideally, but we gotta make it fancy. So I'm actually just going to score it like I regularly would, right down the side. You want to avoid sawing when you're cutting into your loaf to score it. The reason for that is because you don't want to create rough edges. I mean, unless that's the look you're going for. But if you want a smooth ear, which is what that's called, you're gonna wanna go ahead in with a clean blade and one smooth movement. So again, you're just going to stick the tip of your blade right into the bread. You can give it a jiggle here and then bring it down as smooth as you can, all the way to the bottom. And some people like a bigger ear, so they'll actually make this deeper. They'll make this cut deeper. They'll go in again and make it a little bit deeper. So you can do that as well. Okay, so I'm wearing these funny gloves because my oven is totally preheated. Those Dutch ovens are screaming, screaming hot. Please, please, please do not pull them out of the oven with a towel. You have to get some heavy duty gloves. They are super hot. You do not want to burn yourself doing this. Plus they're heavy, so you want to make sure you have a really good grip. Sometimes using a towel is like, you grab it because it's right there, but please, please be safe. Get yourself some really heavy duty gloves. So I'm gonna grab those and we're gonna put our loaves right in there. Okay, here's my first one. I don't know if you can tell, the color has changed because it's so hot. So I'm gonna take the lid off and I'm gonna grab my bread here and just drop it right in carefully and put the lid on. This is gonna go back into the oven for 30 minutes. Here's my second one. I'm gonna grab my bread and I'm gonna drop it right in, put the lid on top and put it in the oven for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes are up, we're gonna take the lid off and continue to bake for another 15 minutes. So total baking time is 1 hour, plus the preheat time at least 30 minutes. So at least an hour and a half of just baking time. Okay, our loaves are ready. I've got my gloves on. I want to show you how gorgeous these turned out. Here's one. Look, that parchment paper comes right off. And, oh, some more parchment paper. Check this out. Gorgeous. The ear, that's what you call that, is nice and puffed up. There's plenty of crust. You can hear that. Check out the blisters. Can you see those? They're beautiful, beautiful blistering. The bottom, nice and hollow. The smell is incredible. And this guy just needs to cool down for about an hour and you can eat. Look at that. Beautiful. This one's spread out a little bit more. That's okay. Every loaf is gonna be different. No two loaves are alike unless you are a machine. All of my loaves are certainly different, but the flavor, the texture is always on point. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull this parchment paper off. And there you have it. Ear, again, plenty of blisters. The bottom is nice and toasty. Crusty crust. Beautiful. They're super hot, so definitely put them on a rack so they don't steam on the bottom and get soggy. You want some airflow while it dries out and cools off. And in about an hour, you'll be ready to cut open.